I am so looking forward to this evening's masterclass, which is how to talk about what we do without scaring people off. And what was amazing is when I was preparing for these masterclasses, I actually thought, well, let's talk about results and let's talk about research and let's talk about, there are all these different things that I want to share with you. And this subject was a little bit of a, well, I'll throw that one in. And this has been the most popular subject. So, so I don't think we can cover everything in this short masterclass, but we will, of course, go into this deeper in the Impact Activator. But I want you to walk away this evening with value. So hopefully I'll be able to share something that's useful to you. I'm Mama J, Jacqueline Hollows, and as you know or may know, I've been working in the prison system and with addictions for the last 12, 15 years, something like that. And I noticed a gap in the market, which is that people get transformed. They have this massive change in their life, and then they want to tell the world. A great example of that was my son a few years ago has been listening to me rabbit on about the three principles for a very long time. Had some sort of, yeah, it sounds good. And he'd had some insight previously, but he sort of thought it was rubbish, really, to be fair. And he came along, we had a little fire outside and he calls my husband Papa, and Papa lit the fire and we were all sat around the fire and he was saying, yeah, but what do you mean, thought? Are you saying this? And he was very intellectual with it all. Whatever I said, which was something like, no, I'm not saying change thought. I'm saying we experience life through thought. For some reason, in that moment, it hit him. And you know what that feeling is like. And he literally just went, wow, wow. That's unbelievable. Wow. And he kept, his mind was blown. And me and my husband were looking at each other, sort of smiling. Ah. And then he went, Mum, we have to tell people. No, he's been editing my videos for about 5 years. I said, what do you think I've been trying to do? But it's a really good example, isn't it, of people don't hear it until they hear it. And then when they do hear it, then they're done, basically. And I had the same situation in the prison system where I worked with 5 governors in my time in one prison. And each time I would think, well, they'll see the results. And then they would say, oh, yes, well, they've changed because we've changed the timing that we deliver the meds. Or they've changed because we've got new security lights. They could never accept that the change came from what we were doing in the groups. So that's why I've built the Impact Activator, is to help people along that journey and to share everything that I've learned along the way. How I started out was working when I say working, that's a very loose term. I met someone who had been a lifelong addict and had been in and out of prison, and he was mainly a heroin addict, but basically he would say that he would take anything. And he'd been 3 years in recovery. So by accident, I fell into that field and I felt like I'd come home when I met those people. They were amazing because he did home detoxes. And so I met lots of people in different stages of addiction. I came to recognize my own addictive thinking and my own disordered thinking around different things. And I fell in love with them all. They were amazing. And I could see their resilience, their determination, their creativity. And I could also see that they couldn't see that, or that they lived in the feeling of the stigma of addiction, no matter where they were in their recovery journey, it seemed to me. So I researched this field heavily, and I saw that the existing paradigm was, and still is, either basically that addiction is a disease, or best case, that you have to manage it so people don't get better. And I kept thinking, that can't be right. I don't believe that. That can't be true. Just intuitively, it just didn't feel right to me. So I read lots, I did lots of books, lots of reading, lots of research, including Gabor Mate, of course, and found that there are little streams like Gabor who don't talk about addiction in that way, but mainly the persistent existing paradigm is that addiction is a disease and you can't recover from it. So you've either got to 12-step for the rest of your life, which seems to be the preference, or you've got to manage it in some way. Tooled up with my new understanding and my complete optimism that everybody needs to know. Initially, I thought, they need to know. People need to know that this is not like my son, that this is not the case. And eventually I thought, oh, it looks like it's me who needs to tell them because I wasn't finding anyone else. So all optimistic I was and all excited. And I literally wore out pairs of shoes, knocking doors, going to all the addiction centres, talking to 12-step communities, lots and lots and lots of conversations. And at that time, pre-COVID, going down to London, seeing different people and trying to sell this idea that there's a new paradigm. And no one could hear me. No one could hear me. Partly because I was coming in with this zealous, I can change the world, it's amazing. And they were looking at me going, yeah, we've been doing this a long time. And, what do you know? Partly because they assumed that I didn't have lived experience. And even though it wasn't a thing in those days, they did like to speak mainly to people who had lived experience. And partly because I just used alien words and they couldn't hear. They couldn't hear what I was saying. And to answer the earlier question, my feeling was one of agenda, pushing, persuading, trying to make them understand. It wasn't soft, curious, wondering. It was really because I was so passionate about it. I volunteered for someone in the community, the guy that I met, and he was making films, and I helped him with a film. And I was walking through the streets of Birmingham, interviewing people and so on for this film because it was a recovery walk. So in the recovery circles, they have a walk every year to celebrate recovery. And I walked into this park in Birmingham. It was a September day. It was absolutely stunning weather. And I saw all these people, all in different stages of recovery and active addiction in some cases. And I just felt love. Love just poured through me. And I loved them all. I just wanted to love them all. And I had the thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I have to work with these people. I love them. Apparently, that was an insight. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't have that language. I didn't understand it. And I met someone, just a random man who, poor soul, who was there. And it was like I was speaking in tongues. I was just like, blah, pouring it all out, "Ah, inside out, whatever words I would have used at the time. Obviously, 12 years on, my language has changed, but whatever words I'd have used, and it was just gobbledygook. It really was. But he heard something, and he heard it because of the feeling that I was coming from. He heard it because I had literally just had this huge insight that I didn't know was an insight. And I was full of love and energy. And he responded to that. He was a trained psychologist and very, very intelligent. He's since passed on, God rest him. And he kept saying, but what about this? And what about that? And I was going, I don't know, but let me tell you about this. And I was just super, super excited, like a little puppy, and just told him everything. What I'm going to tell you not to do. And he said, it sounds really interesting. You need to come and speak to my group, but I need to try and understand it a bit more first. So he booked some time with me, and we had a 3-hour session where he literally threw the book of psychology at me. All the models and all the techniques and all the things. And because I was naive and I didn't know about any of that stuff, I didn't even try and answer it. I knew that I didn't know. So I just would listen. I would try to, it made no sense to me whatsoever. I would try to understand what he was saying. He was so intelligent, so intellectual, and experienced. He'd worked, he himself was a recovering addict, as he called it, and he'd worked with many, many people, so he was very experienced. But every time he came up with something, I'd listen and I would try to get quiet, and then I'd go, I don't know the answer to that. And then I would say whatever else came to mind. So I wasn't resisting him. I wasn't arguing with him. I was completely admitting that that's your field, basically, and this is my field. And let's see if we can find some middle ground. Anyway, I must have said enough, because he said, right, okay, well, I want you to come along to my group. He ran a multi-pathway group, so to recovery, so anybody was welcome. Whereas I had been faced with CBT and 12 steps and very sort of ingrained in their own understanding. But he ran this multiple pathway group where he said, there's more than one path to recovery, and invited me along to his group. And the story continues, but I won't finish the end of that story, because the point to this, to right now, is because I was so innocent, I didn't try to be anything else. I just shared from that feeling, and I shared what I knew. I didn't try to be clever. Now, one of my tips to you is to try to not use language. This is true, as you've pointed out, it's true that the words are less important than the feeling. Absolutely 100%. But you have to hook them in, almost. You have to talk to them where they're at. And I've certainly had conversations when I'm talking about the essence of life and, how we're all nature and we're all one, and so on. And people just go, oh, all right. So another zealot, really, because the truth is there are many, many people who think they've got the thing. We're not the only ones, and the thing is their thing. And so organizations, if you are trying to work with organizations, whether in the charity sector or in the business sector, organizations are used to people going, I've got the next thing for productivity and performance and addiction and this and that. So we need to be different. it is helpful to not talk to things that other people don't understand. We're in the in crowd, aren't we? So we talk about separate realities and thought created experience and stuff that is like nonsense to somebody who's never heard of it. So it's helpful to clean up your language, but you learn that the more conversations you have. So the first thing is turn up as you, in that feeling of wanting to share, wanting to serve. In your transformation story is the most important tool in your toolkit, because whenever you go there, whenever I talk about that time in the park, I still feel it resonating within me. And you can trust that. You can totally trust that. And then the language comes next, but it is useful. I couldn't have got into prisons. It's not true, because there is a prison story where, I did get in with that clumsy language. But then I had to write a business case. And the business case couldn't be full of fluff. The business case had to be exactly what was going to happen, what the structure was, what the expected outcome was, what the research was. I had to create the form of where I was at that time in language that a commissioner could understand. And clearly I was successful at that. If I'd have just tried to go, oh, I'm just going to be, actually that wouldn't have worked. But the starting point is there. And then you learn, you figure it out. Another thing that I found, I've trained many, many facilitators, and me too, is we try to share everything in that first meeting. Like everything we know, everything we've experienced for the last 10 years or 6 months or whatever it is, we want to share it all because we're so enthusiastic about it. And in actual fact, if you share one thing, and you could share that one thing forever, actually. And many of the old school people, Elsie Spittle and all of those, talk about this. And I used to think, well, wouldn't you just get bored eventually? But actually that one thing that you've seen, it gets transmitted in that feeling because you're always going back to that feeling. Now, as we go along, we get more insight, don't we? Or we see more, or we get to experience it in different ways. And I just had a meeting with a potential client, and the client is very analytical, very, very, very analytical. So how would I approach this meeting? Well, first of all, I turned up with no agenda in our first meeting. So no agenda, just let's see what happens. Let's just say, I'm actually grateful to be here. And I turned up with no agenda, ended up being a session for the client because we went really deep, and they used their language. I used their language back to them, and we had a wonderful time. And there was a third person in this session, and she actually got an insight during the session. So that was special. But the potential client wasn't convinced, so they wanted another meeting. So we had a second meeting and we were chatting. And again, I honestly feel like the best meetings are the ones that you turn up to with no agenda. And sometimes that can be hard because maybe you need to pay the rent, or maybe you really want this one to work. But the more you can see, it's not about that person in front of you. Eventually, so a friend of mine, a Jewish friend of mine, says the money doesn't come from people. The money comes from God. You just show up and you do what you know how to do. And at some point, the money, the deals, the contracts, the opportunities arrive. You don't have control over that. And so that's how I live. I show up, I do what makes sense to me, and I see that stuff comes. So again, with this client, I had no agenda. I would love to have her as a client, but I just thought, well, when she's ready, she'll come. And coincidentally, I had just had this amazing shift around food. And I described this story. For whatever reason, I described this story to her that I've been a lifelong yo yo dieter. I've had all sorts of disordered thinking about food and weight and wellness and all of that. And that I'd just realized that I just don't need to do that anymore. And on the next night that I had that shift, I decided I wanted cheese and biscuits for dinner. And I got all my little crackers and my cheeses and my chutney and mayonnaise, and I had them all around me. And I had such fun. I just sat there eating it, and I literally was kicking my feet. And my husband came downstairs and he said, "Are you all right there?" And there it was with all my bits and bobs around me. I said, "I'm just having so much fun." And it was amazing. It was the best meal I've ever had. I told that story and she just got massively impacted. She said, "I can hear the liberation in your story." It was just a simple story, right? But it came from such a place. I can hear the liberation. Wouldn't that be nice if we could all be so liberated? So, of course, I said, well, that's what's possible. That's the conversation, is to find your liberation and to show you that's possible, to go there. Because she's analytical, so she went straight back into her analytical head and said, "But you just made your mind up to do that. Like, where did that come from?" And we started having that conversation. So I explained about insight and so on. I didn't know I was going to share that story. And when I was listening, that's the story that occurred to me. I actually thought when I started sharing it, this is a bit of a silly story to share with someone. But because it was so fresh, of course, she got the feeling of it. And it's the feeling that does the work. When we're in groups and we're running groups, it's a soul to soul conversation. It's the feeling that does the work. But you have to create the environment. And when you create the environment, you're actually just making it as simple as possible for people to be able to come into your zone, or for you to get into their zone and for you to meet. So I've actually gone completely off script. However, magically, I feel like I've covered most of what I wanted to say. The summary is you start with their world, not yours. So you see where they're at and listen to them. And what happens when you do that is you see if something's relevant or not. A potential client I was talking to earlier, it was really clear she didn't need anything from me. In fact, she'd read something that I sent her 2 weeks ago before we set up the call. She'd had an insight and she'd done what she needed to do. So she didn't need anything else. So that just ended up being a really beautiful conversation. Just, two human beings having a conversation. So you get to see that. How can I serve somebody? You serve them by being in their world and seeing where they're at, using everyday language so that they can understand what you're saying until you get a connection, until you feel that you can go wherever you go with that, and then go there if you feel that, because that's what you're being nudged to do, then go there. And I think I would add to that, I've become sensitive to, are they glazing over? Have they switched off? where are they? My whole being is towards, where are they? And and then I just pause. Instead of rabbiting on and trying harder, I'll pull back and say, where are you right now? And it might be that they just started thinking about their dinner, but it might be that something's occurred to them and it's not quite sitting. And if you don't notice that, then they're staying with that and everything. They can't hear anything that you're saying. So it's like really, really being with them and being of service to them. Sharing stories and not explaining things, because stories resonate so much more than explanations and technicals and how-tos. People don't really care about the how-tos. That comes second. Like, how am I going to work with you? How does this program work, etc. The nuts and bolts come second. Where the heartfelt connection comes from sharing stories. And as a writer, I've come to see that we've all got a unique story, but all the emotions everybody else has felt, people felt loss and grief and hardship and frustration and love and all of the things. So when you share your heartfelt story, it resonates with something in them that they've experienced. So that connects way better. The Maya Angelou quote: people will forget what you said, but they never forget how you made them feel. And it's true. They might walk away going, I haven't got a clue. What did she say? But if they walk away feeling good, then they remember you. And that's what we want. And a little really short story to demonstrate that is, we had a tour, a colleague of mine and I went on a tour of the Southwest prisons. And I think we visited about 6 prisons, and it was part of wanting to get this contract with a bigger charity. And so I said, well, let's visit the prisons and talk to the people. And this is just early days, early days. I was working in 2 prisons, but it was quite early on. And so we had about 6 meetings, all up down the length of the southwest of England. And every single meeting, we would ask them, what are your challenges? What are you facing? Where are your gaps? How do you feel about that? We'd listen, we'd ask these questions, we'd listen to their answers. How do you feel? What do you think the answers might be? And we never talked about our program. We just went and did that. And it wasn't like a ploy. That's just how it worked out. And at the end of every meeting, they said, and this is 6 completely different, unrelated people, they said, feel like I've been on a retreat. And like, well, how do we continue this? What are we going to do next? And we won that contract. And and the people that we were taking the contract with, that were very unsure about risking, our product, if you like. But after that, they all must have spoken to them, and we won the contract. And I just think it's because they went, well, if we feel like this, like, how do we bring that into the people that we're looking after? The one that comes to mind, I've seen it many times. I have to say I've seen it many times, but the one that comes to mind is in a high-risk prison. So that would be a prison where they're in for life, usually. There's some, the highest risk crimes. I worked with someone that every time he came to group, so we had, I think we had a 3-day intensive and then we had some follow-ups. Anyway, this fella, every time he came to group, he was off his face because we did group in the morning and that's when he had his meds. So he would have his meds and he was also topping up. And so he would always come to group completely off his face. and practically comatose and often with his head in his hands, rarely shared anything, rarely spoke. And after a few times, I don't know how many, suddenly, excuse anyone who doesn't like swearing, like, close your ears for a minute. Suddenly, he looked up and went, "Fuck me, I've got wisdom." And we all looked like, "Oh my God. Oh, you're awake. Oh, amazing." And he went, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it. The whole of my life, I thought it was this, and this, and it's me. It's been me all along." So that was amazing. And off we went. We were like, "Okay, we'll see what happens to this." And he was on methadone, quite heavy doses of methadone, which is a substitute for heroin, for people who don't know, for people who are coming off heroin. But as I said, he was topping it up with the illegal drugs. So a few weeks later, he didn't turn up to group, so we wanted to know what happened to him, and they said, "Oh yeah, he's requested to stay in his cell. Can we go to see him?" Oh, lots of hums and ha's. Yes, okay, we can go to see him. We have to be escorted in that prison. And we went along to see him, and he was in his dark cell, and he came out and he looked absolutely terrible. And I said, "Oh my gosh, like, are you okay?" And he went, "Oh, I'm more than okay. This isn't okay. This is suffering." Because he said, "I have just completely cold turkeyed. I've come off everything. And so my body is absolutely feeling all the pain of that, but my mind is as clear as a clarion bell." And he said, "At first, I just felt annoyed and I felt like I was grieving because I'm 55 years old and I've lost my life to addiction, thinking I had to be a certain way and I had to do this and so on. And but I've got over my grief, and now all I can see is hope. I have created these calls purely because I want to activate as many people as possible to get going and to get unstuck and to get contracts and to get funding and measure your work, because that's how I feel this is how we'll spread it. People have done their different things of spreading it, but I feel how we'll spread it is by people being looked after, which does come down to being paid and being funded and so on, and people feeling confident and able to be able to go and do whatever they want to do. And that might be in a tiny but perfect. That might be just sharing with a little group down the road, or sharing with your cat, or, it might be just sharing with your family. It might be just living it yourself. Or it might be you want to set up an empire and I know some people on this call who want to set up an empire, but it might be that you want to, be in every town in every world, throughout the world, but in every country throughout the world. Whatever it is that your vision and goal is, I want to activate that. I want to help activate that. And that's because I've worked with hundreds of people. I've seen hundreds of transformations, and I've seen really big transformations. But I also know that everybody gets lost. And I want to create a world when people are lost, they can get found again. And I can't do that on my own. So I want to create a world where those people, when we get lost, we know there's someone there, we can go and find that easily, accessibly, whether you've got nothing or whether you've got everything. I want them to be able to find somewhere, and that's my life's mission.